Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yvonne Ortiz. I am the Training and Education Specialist at the NRCDV. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to this webinar session entitled Guiding Principles for Working with Older Victims of Abuse. I want to introduce our presenters. First, let's welcome Ann Turner. She currently serves as the Elder Victim Services and Advocacy Coordinator for NCALL and has been working in the domestic and sexual assault services field since 1981. She worked with others in a small rural area of northwestern Wisconsin to start a domestic and sexual abuse service agency and served as the executive director of the program for over 20 years. As the Elder Services and Advocacy Coordinator, Ann is responsible for nationwide leadership within the domestic violence and sexual assault movement on enhancing safety and the quality of life of older victims and survivors. Let's also welcome our next presenter, Juanita Davis. She's the Program Manager for the National Clearinghouse in Abuse and Later Life, NCALL. In her role at NCALL, Juanita is responsible for overseeing NCALL's home office operations in Madison, Wisconsin. In addition, she develops training and materials and coordinated community response and works with OVW Abuse in Later Life grantee CCR teams to promote knowledge of and effective cross-disciplinary approaches and responses to abuse in later life. Juanita also provides technical assistance to professionals throughout the country as needed. We want to thank our presenters for joining us today. We're really excited about this webinar. And Juanita, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juanita Davis, and like Yvonne said, I'm the Program Manager with the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, also known as NCALL or NCALL. NCALL is a comprehensive technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women's Abuse in Later Life grant program. NCALL also serves as a National Resource Center and technical assistance provider on abuse in later life. I want to join Yvonne and the rest of the folks at NRCDV and my co-facilitator today, Ann Turner, from whom you will hear from shortly, in welcoming you all to this webinar, which is focused on guiding principles for working with older victims of abuse for domestic and sexual violence advocates and programs. And for those of you who were with us yesterday, we want to thank you for joining us again today on this webinar. And for those of you who are here for the first time for a webinar on this topic, we welcome you as well. And we are very thankful to have all of you join us today, and we are very excited to have the opportunity to spend some time with you, talking with you about this very important topic. And we sincerely hope that you find the information and resources and materials that we present to you as part of this webinar to be of great use to you in your work with older adults and older survivors. I wish to thank the folks at NRCDV, who are our gracious hosts and moderators today during the webinar, for their invitation to do this webinar, and we truly do appreciate their steadfast commitment to improving the safety and quality of life of older victims of domestic violence. And we do appreciate and thank you all for all that you do and for the opportunity to partner with you all as we work in service of this shared mission. I also want to thank our director, NCALL's Director Bonnie Brandel, for her leadership in this area of our work, as well as the many experts in the field who share their knowledge and their skills and their expertise and experiences in working with older adults, so that we can not only work on this project, but also that we could bring all the materials and resources that will be framing our discussion and using this afternoon. And I would like to thank Terra Nova Films for their help with the production of the video resources for this project, as well as I would really like to thank the Department of Justice's Office on Violence Against Women for their support of this very important work and allowing us to bring this project to you. So before we get into the substantive portion of our program, I would like to start today by providing you all with an overview of the agenda for the webinar and the topics that we will cover during our webinar today. So we'll start our program with a short discussion about the Office on Violence Against Women's Abuse in Later Life Grant Program, and then you will hear from my co-presenter this afternoon, Ann, about sort of aging across the country, as well as she'll provide you with a conceptual framework around abuse in later life and what we know about it. Ann and I will then pivot to talking with you all about the history of this work and this collaboration that allows us to bring our summary report today to you. As we will sort of discuss in detail later in the webinar about the summary report. It is the first of 3 parts of our Working with Older Survivors of Abuse Toolkit, which is designed, again, to specifically assist domestic and sexual violence advocates like yourselves and programs in their work with older survivors. And the bulk of our time today will be spent doing a detailed exploration of the various components of that report, and doing a discussion of the framework that informs that report, as well as the many set of guiding principles, minimum guidelines, as well as practical strategies that we have created to help inform how you all think about and then implement and then hopefully enhance your work with older survivors. And then we'll spend some time at the end, spend some time exploring a small selection of video resources that we have created and which are available and hyperlinked within the report. And those videos will allow you as a reader to view a video of a national subject matter expert or a set of experts talking in depth about a key or critical concept covered in the report. And then we're going to end our webinar, as Yvonne said, with a set of questions and a question and answer session in which you can ask questions of us about the topics that we've covered during the webinar or haven't covered during the webinar, as well as any of the resources that we've used, as well as if you're interested in asking us questions about our work and any other topics you see as important to helping you enhance your work with older survivors, we will take those questions as well. So as stated before, my name is Juanita Davis. I'm the Program Manager with NCALL. I won't spend too much time sort of talking about my work, because you've heard about it before, but I will let you know that NCALL is a project of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin, which is the Wisconsin Coalition Against Domestic Violence. We're here in Madison, Wisconsin, and I've been working with NCALL and End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin for a number of years. In my current capacity, like Yvonne said, I work to provide leadership and technical assistance and training and support at all levels to individuals and organizations around their work with older victims of abuse. And I also work with the Office on Violence Against Women's Abuse in Later Life grantee communities around the implementation of their Abuse in Later Life grant work, and I provide targeted support to those grantees as they create or enhance their coordinated community response to abuse in later life. And now I would like to hand this webinar over to my co-presenter, Ann Turner, to introduce herself. Ann?
Hi, everybody. This is Ann Turner. Welcome. I can ditto everything Juanita said, and very much am thankful for the National Resources Center on Domestic Violence for hosting us today. So, I don't have much more to say. I do work with NCALL. My main focus is connecting with domestic and sexual violence programs throughout the United States on enhancing their services around abuse in later life. With the grantees that we work with, my focus is on helping them set up their victim services and do a needs assessment in their community, et cetera. So I'm looking forward to sharing this project with you today, and looking forward to hearing from you too. So thanks for joining us.
All right, so as I mentioned previously, NCALL is the comprehensive technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women's Abuse in Later Life grant program. It's also known as the Enhanced Training and Services to End Abuse in Later Life program. It's an amazing program that helps communities across the country address elder abuse, neglect, exploitation, and exploitation, including domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking against victims who are 50 years of age or older through several initiatives, including training and services. And each year, OVW funds around 9 communities to do this work over the course of 3 years. Through this program, grantees do work to provide direct training to various professionals in the criminal justice system, as well as cross-training to victim service providers and other key professionals and systems who interact with and can help to improve the safety and quality of life of older victims. And as part of this program, grantees are also required to create or enhance a coordinated community response that I mentioned before to specifically address abuse in later life and to affect systems change around that issue in their community. And finally, through this program, grantees develop a plan to address the specific service needs of older victims in their community, which Ann alluded to, and then provide victim services based on the specific needs that have been identified through that particular process. And OVW Abuse in Later Life grantees are required to engage in memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, with partners from law enforcement, prosecution, the Adult Protective Services, or APS, as well as or the Aging Network, as well as domestic violence and sexual assault victim service programs. And for more information about this grant program, you can feel free to visit OVW's website, and I will add that link to the program information into the chat box in just a moment. Anne, would you like to? I'd like to hand it over to you now to talk a little bit more about aging in America.
Right. So, and regarding the grant program, Juanita and I, or anybody at NCALL, is very available to connect with you if you have questions about that grant or are thinking about maybe applying for it in your community. We have several grantees I see on the webinar today, so it's fun to see them joining us. It's a competitive grant, and people say it's a challenging grant when they read it, but I think once people get it and get going on it, they find it makes a huge difference in their community as far as their response to older survivors. So don't hesitate to give us a call if you have any questions. I want to just kind of start talking a little bit about why we need to pay attention to older survivors. I think most of us have heard the statistics and recognize that the baby boomers are aging, and the number of older individuals living in this country is going to increase significantly over the next several years. At this point in time, 10,000 Americans turn 65 every day. That's an amazing statistic. I also think we need to be aware that a lot of these, the majority of them, are older women make up a big part of that population. So I think we will be seeing these populations, or you will be seeing those populations hopefully reaching out for help. When we break this down and look at kind of the racial and ethnic aging population, those numbers are increasing even more significantly. So I think we use the statistic just to get people to recognize that we really need to develop services, and you all know this, so I know I'm preaching to the choir, but really thinking about how do we develop services that's going to serve all survivors. As we look at the aging population and the kind of needs that are going to be knocking on your doors very soon, I think it's important that we make sure that we have, cultural accessible services and proper language services, etc. So really thinking about how can we serve all survivers. This statistic here that 2/3 of the elder abuse victims are women are from a study that was done in New York. And this was a report that really looked at the kind of cases of elder abuse that were being reported in that state. So that's a significant number, that 2/3 of those elder abuse victims were women. So I think, this continues to be a gender-based issue, much like when we're talking about domestic violence. And much of the work that you already do is going to be incredibly helpful for this population. So we wanted to just touch base a little bit on abuse in later life itself, and just so we're all on the same page and understanding what that means. And so NCALL kind of keyed that term, abuse in later life, many years ago, and there was a reason for that. For beginners, we kind of started looking at who was reaching out to domestic violence programs in Wisconsin. And what we noticed was that the numbers of people seeking help after age 50 dropped drastically. And when we started talking to survivors, older survivors, what they said to us is they really did not feel that domestic and sexual victim services were designed for them, that they were meant for younger people, for people with small children at home. So we know that population is not seeing our services as available to them. We also know that between age 50 and 62, there is a major gap in resources that are available for that population. You're often at 50 and over that, your children have become adults and have moved out, so you no longer qualify for any kind of benefits that might be available for families with small children. And you're not yet old enough to take advantage of the aging services that might be available out there. So there's a huge lack of resources available for that population, 50 to 62. We also know that there are many populations in the United States, due to many reasons, whether that be oppression or poverty or health issues, that have much shorter lifespans. So We want it to be inclusive of all populations. So that's part of that definition. I think also what we're looking at, we define the relationship kind of as that trusting, ongoing relationship. So when we talk about abuse in later life, we are talking about domestic violence grown old or domestic violence in later life, but we're also talking about other relationships where there's that expectation of trust, and it's an ongoing relationship. So we include non-intimate partner violence relationships, such as people who are being abused by adult children, etc. When we look at the types of abuse, you're going to see many of the same tactics that you see against younger victims of DV. So you know much of that stuff, especially in the areas of physical and sexual abuse. We also know that a lot of victims, all victims, experience some sort of financial abuse in these relationships. So that can be a method of power and control that perpetrators use. I think when you're older, it becomes a little bit more difficult to recover. So the financial abuse, could wipe out life savings, and clearly, trying to find work and recover financially can be very challenging. And I think there's, much more. There's kind of this belief out there that this is a vulnerable population, and I can gain control of their money. And I think it also kind of becomes that that expectation that this parent or grandparent is going to take care of me and let me use their money, especially if there's any kind of care going on. Neglect kind of refers to those individuals who might have some sort of dependence on another person to meet some of their needs. Then that again gives potential perpetrators another tactic to control that victim. So we need to be very clear about neglect. And examples of that would be refusing to take someone to their needed medical appointments, refusing to purchase food or medicine for that victim. Just not giving them the care that they need and that you have kind of agreed to do. Abandonment is very similar, often goes hand in hand with neglect, and that's kind of a situation where someone would disappear for many days and leave you without that assistance that you might need, without being able to get food for yourself or getting yourself any kind of help. So that's kind of the different types of abuse. It's a little bit some of the differences you might see with younger population. As I mentioned earlier, we go beyond intimate partner violence. We talk about abusers could be an adult child, grandchild, other family member. It could also be a caregiver, whether hired or voluntary. So, we go a little further than with just intimate partner violence. So we want to kind of start by just kind of get some feedback from you. So as you can see, we have a poll up in front. And the question is, have you worked with survivors 50 and over in the last year? So it's just a yes-no response. So if you could just take a moment to check one of those boxes and let us know if you have indeed worked with survivors 50 and over in the last year. We'll give people a few minutes to answer that, and then Justine will show us the results. Thank you. So that's great. 52% of you have served individuals 50 and over. And we're going to follow up and go a little bit deeper into this question now and ask you to really think about the age groups that you might have served with. So we want to kind of break it down by age groups. So if you could think about, if you've served 50 to 60-year-olds, 61 to 70, 71 to 80, and anybody over 90. So click the highest age then that you have served. All right, so we have some results, and it looks like we do have people working with all age groups. That's great. I mean, we're not surprised to see that number dropping down as individuals get older. When we start really looking nationally, we know that a lot of programs are serving victims 50 to 60, but once we start getting past 61, and especially after 71, we see those numbers drop drastically. And again, we don't, one of our goals is really to have our programs really look at that within their own programs and then give some thought. We're hoping that after today you have some ideas on how to expand those numbers and do outreach to older individuals in your community. And now Juanita's going to talk a little bit about what got us started on this project at NCALL.
All right, thank you, Ann. So like Ann said, I want to now share with you all just a brief history of the work that led up to the creation of the summary report and the guiding principles and iterations thereon of which are going to be at the core of our discussion today. So this project really began in the context of work that was being done by the Elder Justice Roadmap Steering Committee. And through the work of this committee, there derived what was became a common understanding around the need for a strategic plan for the elder abuse field. And the document describing that strategic plan now exists in the form of what you see at the bottom right of the slide there, of the Elder Justice Roadmap Project Report. And you can find the Elder Justice Roadmap report online at NCEA's website. I will go ahead and post that in a little bit in the chat box so you can take a look at it later. Within the Elder Justice Roadmap Project Report, there are a number of priorities and action items that were identified as very important to move forward on within the field, the elder abuse field. And one of those action items was identified as very important to move forward quickly, which was to ensure that existing domestic violence and sexual assault and other victim assistance programs better meet the needs of older victims. And in order to effectuate that action item and to bring a very practical and concrete and helpful resource to the elder abuse field and to advocates and programs like you all, NCALL and OVW, in partnership with local advocates and others who serve older victims, conducted a literature review and held national roundtables in 2015 and 2016 with subject matter experts. We also interviewed key stakeholders, and we video interviewed subject matter experts and conducted a writing and external review process to bring to you all what is now a 3-part toolkit around doing this work. So the first part of the toolkit, which was officially released yesterday by way of another webinar that was facilitated by our director, Bonnie Brendel, is the summary report. The summary report is available on NCALL's website, and I'll post that in the chat box in a moment. In addition to the summary report, we anticipate releasing 2 additional components of that toolkit, including a self-assessment workbook in the fall of 2016. And this self-assessment workbook is designed specifically for domestic violence and sexual assault advocates and programs to be a very interactive tool to help you all assess where your program is at with a number of areas related to working with older survivors, and is also sort of intended to help you and your program acknowledge and celebrate the successful aspects of your work in this area, as well as determine pieces in areas wherein you can and you would like to focus effort on enhancing how you do your work so that it better addresses the unique needs of older survivors. And that again will be released, we anticipate, in the fall of 2016. And finally, NCALL is working on and will be creating some training modules on a variety of topics, perhaps including mandatory reporting, victim-defined advocacy, and the benefits of collaboration, to name just a few that we want for you all to be able to use within your programs, or that you can use in your trainings, in your community, or in your state. And so now I want to begin talking more specifically about the summary report. This summary report, like I said, is a document that provides what we hope is a very practical set of information for you all that we hope is a helpful framework for you to be able to assist older victims of abuse and to better respond to and address abuse in later life. And in thinking about what would be an effective framework and meaningful key message for the report and for the toolkit more broadly, that we thought could really help make a profound difference in the lives of older survivors and best help you all in your work with them, we really looked at that key principle framework, and we chose the framework of respect. And we chose this notion of respect because we feel like the idea of respect, along with the really related concept of dignity, is really at the core of what we know through our work with older survivors, what they want and what they need, and what really sort of makes sense. And by implementing work that reflects that principle, we really do believe that advocates and programs can experience significant success and significant progress in their work with older survivors. So as an explanation, I think it's important to kind of go through this graphic that you see here. And it's important to note that each of the guiding principles that we are going to be talking with you all about today are included in the summary report, and they fall under the categories listed in this graphic. So specifically, our guiding principles are focused on helping and ensuring that advocates provide responsive and victim-defined advocacy, as well as the work that you do is having the work that you do be elder-informed when working with older survivors. And these categories, as I said before, include principles related to services and safety and planning and outreach to older survivors, as well as implementing policies that address violence across the lifespan. Additional principles include looking at equity and access considerations and working collaboratively and enhancing training and awareness in your work in your work as a program and in your work as advocates, as well as within your community. So to operationalize and really make that fundamental framework of respect make sense and work for you all and be more concrete, we also came up with these levels of information that we provide within the summary report. The first, as has been mentioned many times previously, we created some guiding principles related to the respect framework, which by definition are those ideals that organizations can really aspire to, and when achieved can really remain part of who an organization is in all the circumstances, and irrespective of sort of what's the forces and currents that are growing in different directions around your work. And what we learned about the guiding principles that we felt were most reflective of the framework of respect, they really did fit quite effortlessly, and authentically within the framework that we chose. So as a point of note, again, I don't need to flip back to it, but I will tell you that the guiding principles kind of fall under that respect framework. And in order to make those guiding principles more tangible and more measurable, we also created minimum guidelines for each of the guiding principles, which allow advocates and programs to determine that if they are doing these things and meeting those minimum guidelines, you're in fact addressing that larger aspirational guiding principle. And then finally, to make these guiding principles and minimum guidelines most practical, we do suggest within the report a number of practical strategies and practice strategies that will allow for you to consider whether you would like to do the work, if so, how do you begin, and how do you meet those minimum guidelines and standards, as well as then eventually moving your work in the direction of, again, those more aspirational principles. And so now I really am excited. I'm looking forward to this. I will hand the webinar over to my co-presenter, Anne, and my colleague to just talk to you more about a few of the guiding principles, and then we'll kind of go back and forth sharing what we know, and we'll also share with you a set of video resources that are supplemental to the guiding principles, or the summary reports, that really fill in key concepts and talk a little bit more about what we discuss in the report. So one of the categories that we, for the guiding principles, we discuss related to responsive and victim-defined advocacy. It's promoting a responsive victim-defined advocacy that respects the values and life experience and culture of an older survivor. And what we really mean by that, in terms of moving forward, is that we really are looking at, what we want to show you all in specifically what might be unique to older victims. So we're asking you all to practice what we call victim-defined advocacy and respectful communication with older adults. And we also are looking for you to all utilize remedies that address the impact of multiple traumatic events, including historical trauma. And we'll talk to you a little bit about that more and show you a video in just a few minutes. And ensuring that an older victim's privacy and confidentiality are protected within legal limits. And I'm sure as Anne comes back and visits the line, again, she'll be able to fill that in a little bit more. So as we all know in our work, older victims can sometimes be reluctant to seek services within the sort of traditional sort of domestic violence and sexual violence organizations because of generational or cultural or religious or spiritual values that stress commitment to family, and in particular to spouses, so spousal obligations or intimate partner obligations, and to your own children and your family. And sometimes older victims may feel guilt or self-blame or embarrassment if they are being abused by folks who should be in a relationship of trust or care with them. And they want to sometimes, they may have the abuse. May want abuse to end, but not be willing to have their abuser, experience systemic sort of interactions with around the justice system, or to become homeless, or to an example of if there's a relationship where a victim may be in a caretaking relationship with their abuser, they do not want to either have their abuser become homeless or lose their independence. So that's sort of what we are talking about around the category of the guiding principle. And what we are looking for around the guidelines of the guiding principles is that we, again, are hoping for you all to practice what we call victim-defined advocacy, which is a term that is sort of more defined through the actual video resource that's available within the report. And we're also asking you to think about the impact of trauma and historical traumas on particular responses that victims may have to abuse, as well as working around what is a tremendously complex challenge around ensuring the privacy and confidentiality of older victims. And in order to kind of show you what I know of as a really great resource that's, again, included within the document itself, I want to show you all a video now around one concept that is explored in great detail throughout in the report, as well as through a video. So if you all, Yvonne and Justine, if you can just start the video on historical trauma, and we'll talk to you a little bit more about that afterwards.
When we work with elders of color, we have to understand that history of oppression, history of gender roles, how have women been treated in the 40s, 50s, 60s, in their country of origin. What was the role of women, so that they have been marginalized, they may have been oppressed. And this takes on connotations when it comes to elder abuse, because they might not see themselves as abused or victims of domestic violence, because this is life. This is what I'm used to.
Historical trauma is the multi-generational impact from abuses that occurred in Indian country to tribal communities that transpired over the course of many generations. And when I say many generations, we're talking hundreds of years. And one example in particular is the boarding school era. And that was federal policy from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. So we have multiple generations that were raised by institutions. So when you think about what you learn from observing your parents and being raised by a family being wrapped around you, that was missing and absent for many generations, not just one generation or two. And as a result of that, we have elders today that have lived in boarding schools and were raised by that. The other thing that was significant about that was about the level of abuses that took place, the high instances of sexual abuse and physical violence that were perpetrated against our Indian children growing up in boarding schools. So we have multiple generations being raised by institutions and multiple generations experiencing that violence. And as we look at how that plays out today, when we open up elder abuse to talk about and work with somebody who is dealing with a current instance of that, we open up those long-term, deep-seated memories that have had very painful effects on that individual.
And when we think about particularly older adults, we can look at who's had the experience of historical trauma. Then we look at how many of our children are abused and sexually molested. And then we look at trauma that may happen in interpersonal violence, possibly with other acquaintances. When we look at the healing process for the older adult, all of those pieces of trauma come into play. And what I've observed and experienced is that we try to blame, when an older adult, particularly an older adult, tries to talk to us about what happened, he or she or they may not use the words of sexual assault, but they're describing the impact, they're describing what it means to them, and they're describing their lack of safety. And so as advocates, it's up to us to be assisting, because we're along for the journey. This is their journey. This is their life. To figure out how that works for them now, and what do they want. And unfortunately for many older adults who had a long lifetime of trauma, they may not know what they want or need. Those are foreign words. When we talk about empowerment, the assumption is somebody ever understood or felt that they had personal power before. And so finding their value, and that's both in recognition, response, and respect.
So moving on to kind of talking about elder informed, the second part of our word respect and the categories we've kind of broken this whole idea down into. So an elder informed is just really encouraging you to involve older adults in your practices, in your planning and designing policy, et cetera, designing services. So that's just kind of thinking about things like maybe even doing a needs assessment or focus groups where you listen to older individuals out in your community to find out what's going on, what do they need, where are their frustrations, really helping them think, having them help you think around what designing services for that population might look like. Inviting older survivors to sit on your board of directors, making sure you hire people from across the lifespan, getting volunteers and to help do your work. When I was doing direct services, we're in a rural area up in northern Wisconsin, and we had a volunteer crew of like 90-some people in our very rural area, and most of them were older individuals that we'd connect with through senior centers and churches, et cetera. So it can be a wonderful resource for your programs. Ask older individuals to do a walkthrough through your shelter and through your office and give you input on what would make that space more comfortable for older survivors who might be seeking help. We've been thinking about putting together like a senior advisory group, to help provide ongoing recommendations and to review some of the policies and practices that you are doing. So that's kind of that elder informed. Much what we do again with younger population, only really focusing in on how can we do this with the older population in a way that works. So looking at services, safety planning and outreach is really looking at how do we ensure that our services and safety planning and outreach really meets the needs of that older population. So again, thinking about how we might go about doing that in a way that's going to better meet the needs of that population. So when we're talking about tailoring services, many of us already do support groups for individuals in our communities. We could consider doing a support group that specifically is designed to meet some of the needs of older individuals with different topics that would be different than what we're using for the younger population. Our legal advocacy will have to expand a little bit so that we understand things like the powers of attorney and guardianships, and does your domestic violence restraining order only cover intimate partner violence? And if so, what are the other options to possibly remove an abusive son or daughter, from the home? Do you understand how to do an eviction? Do you have elder abuse restraining orders in your community? So really thinking about legal advocacy and what additional things you might need to understand and learn about to do that with an older population. Staff needs to be trained on what kind of resources and options are available to older survivors, including your hotline staff. So getting very clear on what's going on in your community for older survivors as far as reaching out to the Aging Network and Adult Protective Services, and that's so those populations that are serving older individuals in your community right now, to find out what they're doing and how you can work together, and how you might want to make those resources available to older individuals who are calling your hotlines or are coming in for services. Follow-up is another thing that's really important to older survivors. I think that most of you who are doing successful support groups know the importance of follow-up and getting people to attend a support group. I think looking at how we're doing our I know that the domestic violence movement, and the sexual violence movement, we have kind of practiced under this philosophy that it's important for victims to reach out to us first, rather than us reaching out to them. And I think I like to say that whole idea of if you build it, they will come is not going to work with this population. It really requires you to get out there, get known, and be seen out there, and possibly make that first contact with older survivors. I think when we're talking about safety planning, we need to really think about what's going to be relevant for older individuals, and that will become clearer for you as you start learning what's going on in your community. I think mandatory reporting is something that can affect older survivors. Mandatory reporting is where a report has to be made or is expected to be made to Adult Protective Services or some sort of elder abuse investigating arm within your community. So clearly understanding that process, and if that's going to affect the older individuals that come through your doors, so that is part of your safety planning process. You know, when is the perpetrator going to be interviewed? How is that going to impact the older survivor? Do we need to get them out of the house before that happens? You know, they also may want to have visitation with grandchildren or an abusive adult child. So doing some safety planning around some of those issues. So really, what you already do with safety planning is going to work really well with this population by just thinking a little broader about it and thinking about what kind of aging services are going on in your community. When we're talking about outreach to this population, clearly, you know, looking at our outreach materials and making sure that they are meeting the needs of the older population. So moving on, now we're going to watch another short video clip. This one is on outreach.
Using terms like perpetrator and abuser are probably not the greatest way to try to speak to mothers who are being, or fathers who are being abused by their children, rather than saying things like the person who is causing you harm or the person who is doing the harm. Often it's also easier, I think, for older individuals to relate to language that kind of describes the tactics that might be used in an abusive relationship, like is somebody not allowing you to leave the house, is somebody taking your money without your permission, is someone making you feel, not making you feel okay, or is somebody touching you in a way that makes you uncomfortable. So thinking about language that you can say that really kind of is discussing the tactics that an older individual might experience. Another thing, I look at a lot of outreach materials out there in the community, and what I find is so often when we're looking about getting information out about services to the older population, we're talking to people about reporting elder abuse. We're not talking to the elders themselves. We're talking to the rest of the community and saying, these people need protection. So I always encourage programs to really look at that, maybe think about, maybe you need to reach out to the elders themselves and say, we are here to help. I also think words like free and confidential make a big difference. That this is a place I can call and nobody else is going to know. I can keep, this private. When we're thinking about outreach, so who are we picturing on our brochures? And thinking about where we're putting this information, I think when we're thinking about marginalized communities, it's all about building relationships with those communities, and which means, showing up and being there, not just dropping off brochures. And so they really recognize who's connected to that brochure.
When we talk about reaching this population, the number one hurdle we have to overcome is denial. And so reaching out, finding avenues to touch that older victim are really very, very challenging. The media doesn't help with that either. Like, for example, if I'm an older woman sitting at home watching television and there's a PSA on and it's about domestic violence and there's a black eye and it's a young woman and she's got a child tugging at her skirt, well, that's not me. And so she doesn't relate to that. Also, even the word domestic violence, you know, not always, but sometimes the abuse in a long-term abusive marriage isn't as physical as it once was. And so when they hear the word violence, they think of physical, which most of society does. Perhaps using different language like abuse versus violence would help. There are challenges in where to reach older individuals. When you're doing outreach, you have to do it as if there is a victim in the audience. And so when you're talking to them, keep talking about how it can be anybody. I often use that statistic, 1 in 4 women, and I make them, you know, look to the front, look to the back, or whatever, so that once again, they're not being singled out. Some of the strategies we use to do outreach are retirement communities. We'll go out and we'll do presentations, perhaps provide a crocheting group so that we can get to know who the people are. I mean, if you're in a community of 55 and older, there's a great chance that there is abuse going on in that community, and you want to reach out to them. We have a very high retirement community in Phoenix, and so we target faith-based communities out in the Sun Cities area because most of the participants are older women. We have great rec centers, and that's another area where we try to target and strategize. And all the obvious places, emergency rooms, clinics, geriatric doctors, really important to go and talk to them. I know it's probably been said many times, but you really need to get out of the office and get into the community and get to know who your community is.
Okay. So these videos are all going to be available on the Guiding Principles documents that you'll all be able to link to and be able to view in YouTube. So don't worry, you'll be able to get to see them a little cleaner. And my apologies for the technology difficulties. And now we're going to move on to talk about the next little phase of our policies. I'm going to turn it over to Juanita.
All right, thank you, Anne. And my apologies as well for the technical difficulties. We did a great deal of background work around this, and what can we say? Sometimes technology just wins. So another category for the guiding principle, in terms of guiding principles in the summary report, is related to organizational policies, as Anne mentioned. And we came up with this category and related guiding principles because, you know, what we learned through our process over the years is that in the years that, and in the decades wherein domestic violence and sexual assault programs were crafting services, often older adults were not initially reaching out to these your programs and services or for services, and as a result of that underutilization of services, the policies and procedures around sort of working with victims that were developed within programs were really created without the input of older victims. And as a consequence, some of the existing policies have unintended, ageist sort of consequences that can really serve to deny or limit services for some older victims. So if you think of like a policy that may limit access in some domestic violence agencies to victims of only intimate partner violence, where the reality for some older where in contrast the reality from some older victims is really incongruent with that policy because they may be, as we've mentioned before, being abused by their adult children or other family members or caretakers. And others who are in that, again, that trusting relationship. So in this report, we thought that it made a lot of sense in order to enhance the safety and quality of life of older victims, that we really need to look at those services and those advocates in the programs, and you can, instead of that using those types of policies, you can really begin to institutionalize within your policymaking process a real and a very steadfast commitment to addressing violence and harm across the lifespan, specifically and intentionally including older adults in that process. So the specific guidelines that we believe would best assist advocates and programs to move closer to that aspirational objective would be to implement policies that reflect abuse across the lifespan, like I said. So for example, thinking about creating a welcoming and inclusive environment for older victims. And simply, it could be as simple as using the term across the lifespan when we're speaking of services that you would be providing, as well as perhaps engaging in what we call mobile advocacy. And there's an excellent video complementing this concept within the summary report that really explains this idea very well. But put very simply, what we mean by mobile advocacy is really meeting older victims where they are. So one thing that we know about older victims is that soliciting help from advocates or programs is not always a likely avenue by which an older victim will access services. So allowing others in their social support networks like family or friends or et cetera, to ask for assistance on behalf of that older adult may be helpful in that situation. In addition, if there are mobility or transportation challenges to meeting with an advocate where the advocate may be working, to the degree that safety is not compromised for either the victim or for the advocate, perhaps you can explore options around meeting an older adult outside of the program space and in place including but certainly not limited to a senior center or perhaps a healthcare provider's office. Those are just a few ideas that can be sort of implemented in the form of policy. In addition, one of the guidelines in the report and under this category is around adopting guidelines that include older victims who are being abused, like I said, by someone that they love or trust. And that's just going back to the example that we have put in place before, and considering creating eligibility definitions specifically that include older individuals who are being abused by somebody other than their intimate partner. And then last, in terms of the guidelines, we do suggest that advocates in programs work to ensure that existing policies respect the confidentiality, privacy, and autonomy of older victims while addressing issues like mandatory reporting and statutory schemes like that. And without going into a great amount of detail there, because we do sort of explore that in the report, what we are talking about here is really about creating and implementing policies that address existing state and perhaps tribal statutes on mandatory reporting, and including policies that, while also informing older adults, that would help to inform an older adult about those requirements around mandatory reporting that may exist, and inviting that older adult to be a part of that reporting process if they are interested. And that's just to name a few. And certainly you all can do more or different things than is around your policies than what we are encouraging here, but we do encourage you to think about these options as you move forward in your work on this issue. So now I wanted to show you another short video in which you will hear sort of various subject matter experts talking about the importance of embracing this guideline and of reviewing and, where appropriate, revising those policies so as to address abuse across the lifespan. And as we previously have mentioned, this and other videos can be accessed electronically through the document directly, or if you are not looking at an electronic version of the document, you can refer to the video links that are included in the document on a grid on page 41 of the summary report.
Reviewing our policies internally in domestic violence and sexual assault programs is crucial, and then involving people who might be served from a variety of communities in that process is vital to making sure that the policies address the needs of those various populations. So specifically when we're thinking about older adults, one of the first things that I would consider is looking at your board of directors and how many older adults are in a position where they're meeting regularly on the board of directors as policy issues are coming up and being addressed, to be sure that there are not unintended consequences that come from potential policy changes. Second thing I would think about is doing an analysis periodically of your policies. On our website, the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life, we have a self-assessment tool that might be helpful in terms of doing that policy analysis, where you can look at questions under a variety of categories like access and safety planning, and sort of look at where you might be in relation to some of the questions there. Is this something you do already and feel very strong in? Something you're kind of sort of doing and you wish you could do better? Something you'd never thought about before and might be a good idea? Or something you read it and think, boy, that's just not a good fit for us at all. Interesting idea, maybe works elsewhere, not something we would do. And that tool is a nice way to sort of look comprehensively from beginning to end at your programming. It's designed to be done with a team of staff, but could certainly involve the input of older adults as well as part of that conversation. I would also think about conducting listening sessions or focus groups with older adults to get some feedback. And then finally, you've got a great opportunity if you're out doing presentations to older adults at some point in the presentation to just ask, what do you hear about our services? What do you know about what we do? See if it actually connects with what you are doing. Are there gaps in their knowledge? And what is your reputation with this particular population? Have they heard good things? Do they know people who have used your services? My experience has been, when I ask that question about local programs, that older adults will often say to me, I would refer my granddaughter there. I think they do great work. I have heard great things, but they never make the connection that it might be a place for them. And so that's an easy way to begin to gather some data and information.
Now that the video is over, I'd like to move on and sort of explore another category for the guiding principles a little bit in more detail, and that's around equity and access, and specifically around providing equitable services that are inclusive to older adults. And this notion really stems from what we know to be true about abuse in later life victims and survivors, and that is that abuse in later life, like Ann mentioned before, like forms perpetrated against, as mentioned before, sort of occurs across all cultural, racial, and ethnic and religious backgrounds, as well as across all statuses, nationalities, and ranges of ability, sexual orientations, gender identities, and generally any other identity facet in life. And for that reason, if services are not culturally and otherwise specific or appropriate or designed to meet the unique needs of a particular population or subpopulation, it can really exacerbate existing vulnerabilities for older adults in need of services. So when we talk about the unique needs of this population of survivors, we can mean things like sort of addressing those unique needs. We can be meaning the importance of faith and spirituality in life, as we've mentioned previously, as well as the generational sort of conceptions of abuse and what should be done about abuse, and the specific values and norms around familial and spousal obligations. And we can also mean issues and concerns for this population around accessibility of services, and et cetera. And certainly the list that I'm talking about is not exhaustive. And so in thinking about the unique needs of older victims, the guidelines we recommend in this area are really focused on doing the things that create that welcoming and inclusive atmosphere that I've been talking about for all victims from diverse backgrounds and identities, as well as ensuring that barriers that limit access for persons with mobility and communication issues are addressed at the same time. And this first guideline is worth noting because I think that when you are thinking about the various opportunities you have as advocates to make older adults feel welcome, as they receive services from you and your program, this can mean a number of things. Whether in practice that means speaking to an older victim about their communities of support, so if they're involved in that faith community or that spiritual culture community, talking to them about it and ensuring that they are supported and nurtured and being a part of that community even as they work through the abuse that they are experiencing. Or whether it may also mean asking an older victim about the intersecting identities that they have as individuals. So for example, an older victim may identify as a member of a marginalized population or even as a member of multiply marginalized populations or communities, and thinking about how you can in your work with them create an environment wherein they feel safe and understood and listened to. And the report goes into greater detail about this idea, and I encourage you to review this in other sections as you think about your work and how it can be enhanced in this area. And in that second guideline, this section is really about thinking about ensuring that you are aware of and follow the Americans with Disabilities Act accessibility requirements in your workspace and in the way that you the way that you do and implement your work in terms of your specific policies around communication, as well as sort of accessibility and spatial things, as well as the language access and other requirements that are detailed within the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So some examples that might work for you around this principle here, might be, for example, implementing universal design in your work and in your shelter space, if possible, if you have that. And you might also think about building in and maintaining relationships, for example, with interpreters or translators who know and really understand the confidentiality policies of your program, as well as understand trauma in the context of domestic and sexual violence. And those are simply, again, those just a few examples of what we're thinking about here. But in the interest of time, I think we should sort of move that forward. But again, I encourage you to take a look at the report and the videos that supplement the report within it. Extending that notion of working together in those relationships and building those and maintaining those relationships together with key partners toward that common goal of enhancing the safety and quality of life of older victims, the next guiding principle in the report is something that we at NCALL know of and speak of at great length about in our work, and it's really a key message of our work, and that is around the importance of collaboration and working with allies and various organizations that work with and on behalf of older victims of abuse. And some of those collaborative partners, I just want to point out, may not be the same cast of sort of collaborators you might work with in cases where the victim is younger. And we'll talk about that idea a little bit more in just a moment. So in terms of the guidelines that we recommend in this summary report in this area, we really think that it's important for effective collaboration in abuse in later life cases to have advocates and programs talk about and learn about first what resources are available to assist older adults in your community, because you can really what we know about elder abuse cases is that they're very complex. And without leading too far into the next video, I will know that knowing what resources and referrals are available is going to be key. And key partners in this learning process, again, can be those folks from the Adult Protective Services arena, as well as the Aging Network, the faith leaders within your community, culturally specific programs, folks from the civil justice and civil legal professionals and criminal justice systems, as well as folks from perhaps mental health and substance abuse, medical professionals, and the list kind of goes on and on. In addition to that, what is also critical, we believe, to ensuring that all the needs of an older survivor are addressed is to work collaboratively with other professionals to improve the response of various systems to abuse in later life. And in the report, we do talk about the importance of actively participating in or even leading a coordinated community response or CCR team, or participating in the same, and also leading those multidisciplinary teams that deal within this issue, so SART teams, FAST teams, etc. And we explore that a little bit more in the report. And keeping, again, that victim-defined advocacy notion and victim safety and confidentiality in mind as you do that work. And I do think that the next video we will show you really does a great job of talking about the importance of collaboration and is a great supplemental resource that speaks very well to this topic. And I certainly do not say it because I'm featured in it, but I will let you know that I just as full acknowledgement of that, but it certainly is a great video. So now I want to show you that video in which we talk about the benefits of collaboration in this context of abuse in later life. And Yvonne and Justine, if you can please bring up that video on enhancing or on collaboration and the benefits of that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
By definition, collaboration is essentially about bringing individuals, organizations, and systems together around a common purpose. I think in the context of abuse in later life, collaboration is a very critical component of having an effective response to abuse in later life. I think that because as we know elder abuse and abuse in later life cases are very complex, and rarely can one institution or organization or individual effectively address all of the complex needs of an older victim. And what is really needed is collaboration amongst and between key interveners and key partners in abuse in later life cases.
To be collaborating within the community means knowing the community. So that means identifying, thinking outside the box. You know, we typically think about Area Agency on Aging, we typically think about Adult Protective Services, we typically think about, and it may be different acronyms depending on where people live, triads, Elder Abuse Task Force, we typically think about the luncheon programs, the senior health fairs, all of those. And thinking outside the box is really important. So it means making a phone call, means showing up for a meeting, it means being productive with that time. It's the opportunity to meet each other. It's also the opportunity to figure out how we strengthen each other's services.
One thing that we've done is partner with the agencies that are in Milwaukee that are culturally specific. We always make these statements that you can learn about another culture or educate yourself and you could be versed in it. And it sounds good, but it's better when you can do a collaboration or a collective with agencies that are providing specific culturally based services and allow those individuals in your facility.
You can begin to provide and learn from each other. None of us have the answers all ourselves. That's the beauty of working collaboratively, is we build on the expertise of others, all for the goal of ensuring that these victims, that one survivor, gets what he or she needs to be able to move forward and heal, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's adult protective services, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, or disability services. We have to find out from each other, in your field, what works, and in your field, what doesn't work, so that we're not repeating the same mistakes that other organizations have figured out 20 years ago. It's building upon, working from, and really elevating the collective knowledge. Why? Because victims and survivors matter, and we can do more by learning from each other how best to figure that out for folks who don't fit the typical profile of who we think of as victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence.
All right, thank you, Justine, for playing that video. And again, I just want to let you all know that these videos are embedded, or not included within the summary report that we are discussing today. And they're really an excellent resource, and we hope that you all are able to view them, for those of you who can't see them now, and refer to them as you do your work around working with older survivors. And I just want to note quickly that we are showing you only a portion of those videos that can be viewed as part of this document. So please be sure to check more of them out as you can and are interested. So on to our final category for our guiding principles, which focuses on enhancing awareness of abuse in later life through training and education on this issue. And this may seem sort of like a no-brainer for many, but it's really, this section is really helpful in terms of putting the rubber to the road around what you all can do to address, again, going back to the unique needs of older victims in this unique population and how you can raise awareness around this issue. So again, what we know about abuse in later life is often it's a very hidden and very invisible topic for domestic violence and sexual assault programs and staff, as well as older victims of abuse. And for that reason, program staff and volunteers and board members, as well as professionals in your community, may need to sort of grow and enhance their expertise on addressing the needs of older victims. In addition, some older adults may themselves think that only younger people, specifically younger women, experience domestic violence or sexual abuse, and that older adults, especially males, are not abused. So there's a lot of misconception and sort of myth-busting that has to go on within this area, certainly, and even though we've made a tremendous deal of progress in our work. And as we discussed previously, some older adults may not even consider some types of abuse and emotional harm as abuse, and some may consider what we might look at in terms of might be financial exploitation. They may look at it, in fact, differently around and have different values around sort of sharing of resources or using of resources more specifically. And for those reasons, service providers, we think that service providers and older victims can both, as communities of sort of benefit around having training and resources and materials that educate people on abuse in later life, and those same things around training and resources and materials that challenges those sort of populations to rethink social norms around aging and around victimization. In addition, if you and your programs are able to facilitate trainings on the dynamics of domestic violence and sexual assault in later life to groups of allied professionals, as well as yourself, that may be of benefit to those professionals as well, and to older adults as well. And if you are able to or use or develop materials on abuse in later life which describe signs of abuse and resources designed for older adults and those people who care about them, and disseminate those materials at places where older adults may gather and the people who care about them may gather. That could include healthcare facilities, senior centers, etc., as well as promote, I think this is a really great opportunity, awareness of the issue of abuse in later life on days and months like World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is on June 15th, and we'll talk to you about that a little bit more later. Those activities can certainly increase public awareness of this issue and therefore education around this issue, and affect on balance your ability to respond. And finally, it's important to really consider doing those things that you can to promote the dignity and respect of older individuals by celebrating and recognizing aging in a very positive way, as well as challenging what would be considered to be ageist comments or jokes and policies, and really promoting, again, that dignity and respect for adults and individuals across the lifespan. And this and other practical strategies are outlined in the report and really can help to make a profound and positive difference in the lives of older victims. And we really thank you for considering all of these things and all of these strategies, all of these guidelines, and all these sort of minimum practical opportunities in doing your work. And now I'm going to pass the webinar back to my co-facilitator, Anne, so that we can hear a little bit from you about your thoughts about the summary report, about what you might do moving forward to either change or make progress in your work. So Anne, are you on the line?
I am on the line. So can everybody hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to do another poll. Now, as you know, we have just gone through that, all the different categories that we've included with that acronym RESPECT, that response and victim-defined advocacy, much of what you already do, but really thinking more broadly around these things for older population. Elder-informed, where we're engaging older adults in our work and guiding us in our policies. Services, safety, planning, and outreach, really thinking about how we're providing these services and how we're doing outreach so that we're more inclusive of older victims. The same with our policies, looking at those a little from the perspective of access for older individuals, along with equity and access. Collaboration, expanding who we're collaborating with now to include those that might come in contact with older victims, and then that training and awareness so that we're not only getting ourselves trained, but we're also collaborating with others in the community to do training for them on the issue. So when you're thinking of those guiding principles that Juanita and I have gone through today, which ones do you think, okay, we're probably only going to be able to pick one. So if you were to pick one that would give you, that's probably going to be, or you feel is going to be the most challenging for you at this point in time, or most challenging for older individuals who are seeking services, which one would you pick from that list? Which of the guiding principles are currently creating barriers for older survivors accessing your agency? Give everybody a little bit time to answer. Okay, interesting. Thanks, folks, for answering. So we're seeing the highest is safety planning and outreach and training and awareness. So we're hoping that this document's really going to help you think around that, those issues, and give you some good tools to use in your community, especially once we start dividing or designing the training materials. Those are going to be accessible to programs to download and use within your own programs and to take out in the community if you want to. So we really are trying to make resources that are going to work for you. So thanks for answering that. And now thinking about, in the little chat window where you can put an answer, thinking about what you could do, like in the next 30 days, if you were to, from what Juanita and I shared with you today, as bouncy as that was with our technology challenges, is there one thing that you think you could do within the next 30 days to make changes within your agency that would make it more comfortable for older survivors. And if you could just write that down in the chat room, and just to kind of create some sort of discussion. More training, that's great. Andrea, thanks. And great answers. Getting out in the community more. Lots of more trainings. People are asking for more training. A lot of comments on outreach. Outreach becomes a huge issue with this population because, as we said earlier, they often don't feel our services are for them. Mm-hmm. Some great work going on out there. It's fun to see all your comments. Again, just reiterate that this document is going to come to you in the form of a link at the end of this training. At that point in time, you'll be able to read the document. The videos are linked throughout that document that just kind of enhance what you have just read when you're reading the document, including the videos that we tried to show today. So I really, we very much appreciate your input here and your commitment to make a difference for older survivors. So we wanted to take a few moments just to see if there were any final questions that people had regarding the webinar today. We'll just take a minute you can type your questions in the chat box.
Thank you, Ann. We did have a couple questions that came through. The first one was, do you have any suggestion for how to work within a criminal justice system that threatens bench warrants for victims, survivors, that are reluctant to come to court for a multiple of reasons?
Ooh, that's pretty rough. And is this directed, I'm wondering if this is directed at older survivors or all survivors. You know, I think that I used to work in a very rural community, and we had lots of those kind of challenges, especially when mandatory arrest first got implemented, et cetera. And I think one of the best ways we ended up dealing with it was to find allies within the community, and we addressed some of those. We tried to address some of those issues starting kind of on a one-to-one basis. So we ended up, we really did seek allies besides, we were working in a domestic sexual assault dual program, so we really sought allies outside the community that could reach out. So we had a probation and parole officer who was highly respected in our community. He'd been there for a long time. It was a male. I think that was helpful. We had a male judge that was extremely challenging. And then, so he kind of started the conversation. We talked to him ahead of time, told him some of the issues. So he kind of started the conversation with the judge on a one-to-one with some really clear understanding on, where the risks were for survivors in the decisions that the judge was making. So I would encourage you to start, if possible, if the domestic violence program is not a good option, to figure out some way to connect with that individual who's causing the problems on a one-to-one and have that conversation. Who is a good ally in your community, that has the respect of this individual that might be willing to reach out and have that difficult conversation. Juanita, do you have any other suggestions?
I do not at this time, thank you, though. But if there are any other questions, I'm certain I could have some commentary on that. But I thought you did a great job, Ann. Thank you.
I have a few more. We've had a couple comments around the issue of denial. I believe what the commenter was trying to get to was the denial that elder abuse exists, maybe even among the elderly themselves. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, how to address that, both when dealing with the elderly or maybe with their family members.
I think that really goes to sort of something that we've been mentioning throughout this webinar today, and it's really about a couple of things, in my opinion. First is around sort of what we conceive of as a society as a whole of what who and what a victim is, and so as well as sort of with this population in particular, we also can experience in terms of their understanding and sort of conception of what is abuse. There is a little bit of a challenge around that because, like we've mentioned before, there may be both generational and intergenerational differences in how people think about abuse. So if you think about sort of the broad swath of people that we were talking about here, anyone who is 50 or older, we certainly have generations, sub-generations within that may think of abuse in different ways and may have different values and understandings around what it means. In addition to that, we have this overarching sort of social conception, which in many instances is a very ageist conception that really does marginalize and minimize the idea that older folks can be victims of abuse and what to do about that and what it means to be a perpetrator of abuse. And so, I mean, one of the things we'd like to suggest, and I think we go into detail around in the document itself, around being elder informed and also creating that level of education and that awareness, that piece that you all are identifying is really important to address the concerns around people not being believed that that abuse is happening, older victims perhaps not conceiving of abuse in the same way, but again, respecting those sort of their cultural and generational and interpersonal and just individual values around what it means, and kind of breaking through those barriers through education and awareness, but also understanding that's sort of a longer and harder road to hoe because it is really difficult to, I mean, realistically, if you think about the dynamics that exist within abuse in later life, thinking about older victims who are being abused by perhaps their family members, again, their children or their grandchildren, that level of denial and shame and guilt that does exist, and that level of embarrassment and that level of concern perhaps even around who their abuser is and for their abuser is a real strong sort of feeling and sentiment that you have to really work within and really, again, respect sort of how people feel about it, but help them to the extent that they are exercising their own individuality and autonomy and decision-making around that, because, again, you don't want to become or be that sort of ageist force in their life that you're telling them how to respond and what to do, as opposed to talking to them about what they think are positive and good solutions for their circumstance. So, Anne, I don't know if you want to say anything else.
No, I think you did great. I think, thinking about your outreach again, what's the language like in your outreach? And again, remember, it's not our job to convince somebody they're being abused. Our job is to say, this is what we do. This is how we can help. This is what might be going on in your life, and it may not. And so you're just kind of planting a seed to say, here I am, and at some time, maybe that individual will want to reach out.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Elise asked, are there resources for networking with other communities that are further along with outreach and developing elder-informed services? And before you answered, we did get some responses. Elder Listserv was recommended as a good resource, and nismichigan.org was also listed as a resource.
So NCALL also has an Abuse in Later Life Advocates listserv. At the end of this presentation, you'll see my email address. I facilitate that. So it is right now I think there's like 100 advocates on that listserv. Some of them have been doing this work for a very long time. So it's an excellent resource to communicate with other advocates who are doing this work. So if people are interested in being on that listserv, they can contact me, and I will get your email address on there.
Thank you to our facilitators, Juanita and Anne. You have done a great job. Yeah, we're running out of time. If you could share some final thoughts, especially talk about our upcoming events on June 15th.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would just like to take a moment to say a little bit about an important date that's coming up for NCALL as well as NRCDV and our wonderful partners in this field, and that is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, which is on June 15th. World Elder Abuse Awareness Day was launched in 2006, and it's an excellent opportunity to provide communities around the world to promote a better understanding of abuse and neglect of older people. And in recognition of what we call WEAD, NCALL and our organizational counterparts are doing a number of special events, and you can certainly check our website for more information about that. And we also have created a number of awareness materials like you all are asking for, and modifiable graphics that you can use online for yourself. along with a list of selected resources for you all to use and review should you be interested in doing so. And then certainly we have those resources that we are going to be emailing you afterwards, including the actual summary report for the Working with Older Survivors of Abuse framework for advocates, as well as I really want to plug a wonderful resource that NRCDV hosts, which is the ValNet website, and that link to that program I'm sure you all can use, but it's a plethora of resources around preventing and addressing abuse in later life. And that's all I really wanted to say, and otherwise I would love to thank you all as participants in NRCDV as a host for joining us and hosting the webinar. We're very proud of this report. I'm really happy to have had the opportunity to talk with you all, and I thank you sincerely for all that you do on behalf of older victims of abuse.
Yep, just saying goodbye, everybody. Thanks for participating, and please reach out if you need some support or have additional questions.
Thank you so much, both of you. This has been a great session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And please be sure to check out our upcoming webinar. It's going to be on July the 8th. It's the title, Preventing Compassion Fatigue, Honoring Thyself. And you're going to get some information about our upcoming webinar in the follow-up email. Thank you, everybody, and have a great evening.